On a freezing Tuesday morning in downtown Detroit, a broke widower in worn-out work boots stood inside the most expensive car dealership in the city and told a room full of tailored suits that their million-dollar flagship vehicle was about to kill someone. Nobody believed him. The arrogant sales director actually laughed. But when the dealership owner, a young woman fighting to save her dying family empire, walked through those glass doors and heard what he said, everything changed. That broken man wasn't just another desperate applicant. He was the ghost of a racing legend everyone thought had vanished forever. And he was about to prove that talent doesn't wear expensive shoes. If you want to see how a single moment can rebuild a man's entire life, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Mason Ryder's daughter asked him the same question every morning. "Daddy, are we going to be okay?" She was 6 years old. She shouldn't have to ask that. But Chloe wasn't stupid. Kids never are. She saw the unopened envelopes stacked on the kitchen counter. She noticed when Mason skipped breakfast so she could have cereal. She felt the apartment getting colder because he kept the heat turned down to save money. And every single morning, when he dropped her off at the neighbor's place before heading to work, she looked up at him with those big worried eyes and asked the same damn question. Mason always smiled, always kissed her forehead, always promised her the same lie. "We're going to be fine, sweetheart." But on this particular Tuesday morning in late October, as frost crept across the cracked windshield of his 15-year-old Honda Civic, Mason wasn't sure he believed it anymore. He was 32 years old, a widower, a single father, and he was 3 weeks away from losing everything. The garage where he worked, a cramped, oil-stained repair shop wedged between a pawn shop and a shuttered liquor store, was closing at the end of the month. The owner, a wheezing 70-year-old man named Lou, had finally given up trying to compete with the corporate chains. Mason had seen it coming for months. Fewer customers, slower weeks. Lou spending more time staring at the bills than fixing engines. When Lou pulled him aside last Friday and told him the news, Mason just nodded. No anger, no surprise. Just the hollow, familiar ache of watching another piece of his life collapse. He had $2,000 in his checking account. Rent was $1,200. Chloe's daycare was another $400. Groceries, utilities, gas. It all bled together into a math problem that never added up. So when his phone buzzed 3 days ago with a message about an interview at Silvercrest Motors, Mason didn't hesitate. He didn't care that the job posting was vague. He didn't care that he had no experience working at a luxury dealership. He just needed something, anything. The interview was scheduled for 10 o'clock. Mason dropped Chloe off at Mrs. Kowalski's apartment at 8:30, ignoring the way the elderly woman's face tightened with pity when she saw his shirt, the same charcoal button-down he'd worn to his wife's funeral 2 years ago. It still fit, barely. He'd lost weight since then, not from the gym, just from forgetting to eat. "Good luck, dear," Mrs. Kowalski said softly, squeezing his hand. Mason nodded and kissed Chloe goodbye, promising he'd be back by lunchtime. The drive downtown took 40 minutes. Silvercrest Motors sat in the heart of the financial district, a gleaming glass and steel monument to wealth that looked more like an art museum than a car dealership. Mason had driven past it 100 times but never gone inside. Why would he? People like him didn't belong in places like this. He parked 3 blocks away in a crumbling public lot where it only cost $5 for the day. The walk gave him time to rehearse what he was going to say. But the closer he got, the more ridiculous the whole thing felt. What the hell was he doing here? He was a guy who fixed rusted-out Hondas and rebuilt carburetors for $200 a pop. Silvercrest sold cars that cost more than most people's houses. They didn't need someone like him. They needed polished salespeople with white teeth and designer watches. They needed people who knew how to talk to millionaires without sounding desperate. Mason wasn't that. But he kept walking anyway, because desperation has a way of making you do things pride would never allow. The dealership's entrance was a massive wall of spotless glass. Mason caught his reflection as he approached and almost turned around. His jacket, thrifted charcoal fraying at the cuffs, hung awkwardly on his thin frame. His shoes were scuffed leather work boots he'd tried to clean with a wet rag that morning. His haircut was 2 months overdue. He looked exactly like what he was, broke. Inside, the dealership felt like stepping onto another planet. The floors were polished white marble that reflected the overhead lights like a mirror. Sleek European sports cars sat on raised platforms beneath soft golden spotlights, each one more expensive than anything Mason had ever touched. A massive chandelier hung from the vaulted ceiling, sparkling like something out of a palace. The air smelled faintly of leather and cologne, and everyone, every single person, looked like they belonged there. The receptionists wore tailored black dresses. The salespeople moved across the floor in perfectly pressed suits, their shoes clicking softly against the marble. Even the customers looked rich. Middle-aged men in cashmere coats, young women carrying designer purses, all of them moving with the easy confidence of people who had never worried about rent. Mason stood just inside the entrance, suddenly very aware of how loudly his boots sounded on the marble. A young woman behind the reception desk glanced up at him. Her smile was polite but distant. "Can I help you?" "I've got an interview," Mason said. 10 o'clock. For the technician position. She looked him up and down, not obviously, but he saw it, and tapped something into her computer. "Name?" "Mason Ryder." Another pause, more typing. Then she picked up the phone, murmured something Mason couldn't hear, and hung up. "Someone will be with you shortly. You can wait over there." She gestured toward the seating area near the window. Sleek black leather chairs arranged around a glass coffee table stacked with magazines about yachts and watches. Mason sat down carefully, like the chair might break under him. Minutes crawled by. He watched salespeople glide past, shaking hands with clients, laughing at jokes he couldn't hear. He watched a man in a three-piece suit test drive a cherry red convertible that probably cost more than Mason would earn in 5 years. He watched the receptionist answer calls in a voice so smooth it sounded rehearsed. And the whole time, a single thought kept circling his mind. "I don't belong here." "Mr. Ryder?" Mason looked up. A man in his early 40s stood in front of him, arms crossed, expression already bored. He wore a navy suit that fit him like it had been made specifically for his body. His hair was slicked back, his watch gleamed. Everything about him screamed authority. "I'm Derek Calloway," the man said flatly. "Sales director. Come with me." He didn't offer a handshake. Mason followed him across the showroom floor, past rows of luxury vehicles, toward a hallway lined with offices. Calloway moved fast, like he had better things to do. Mason had to lengthen his stride to keep up. They entered a small glass-walled conference room. Calloway sat down, flipped open a folder, and barely glanced at the resume inside. "So," Calloway said, not looking up, "you're a mechanic." "Automotive technician," Mason corrected quietly. Calloway's eyes flicked up, cold, unimpressed. "Right, technician." He said the word like it tasted bad. "And you've been working at—" He squinted at the resume. "Lou's Auto Repair." "Yes, sir." "For how long?" 4 years." Calloway leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "Let me be honest with you, Mr. Ryder. This dealership serves a very specific clientele. Our customers don't just buy cars. They buy experiences. They expect precision, exclusivity, a level of service that reflects the value of what they're purchasing." He paused. "We're not looking for someone who changes oil and rotates tires." Mason kept his face neutral. "I understand. Do you?" Calloway's tone sharpened. "Because frankly, I'm not sure why you're even here. You don't have luxury brand experience. You don't have dealership experience. And based on what I'm seeing," he gestured vaguely at Mason's jacket, "I'm not convinced you understand the culture we've built here." The words landed like a slap. Mason's jaw tightened. He wanted to stand up and walk out. He wanted to tell this smug bastard exactly where he could shove his culture. But he thought about Chloe, about the eviction notice he'd probably get in 2 weeks, about the way she looked at him every morning, trusting him to hold their world together. So instead, he swallowed his pride and kept his voice steady. "I've worked on everything from 60-year-old muscle cars to modern hybrids. I've diagnosed electrical failures, rebuilt transmissions, and restored engines most people would have junked. I know how things work, and I know how to explain that to people who don't." Calloway smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "That's quaint? But this isn't a repair shop, Mr. Ryder. This is Silvercrest Motors. Our technicians don't just fix problems, they maintain perfection." He closed the folder. "I don't think this is the right fit." Mason stared at him. "You're serious?" "Completely." "You're not even going to ask me a technical question?" Calloway stood up, already moving toward the door. "I don't need to. I can tell when someone's out of their depth." And just like that, the interview was over. Mason sat there for a moment, stunned. Not because he was shocked. He'd expected some level of judgment, but because of how quickly and casually Calloway had dismissed him. Like he wasn't even worth 10 minutes of effort. He stood slowly, fists clenched at his sides, and walked back into the showroom. The anger burned hot and quiet in his chest. Not the explosive kind, the kind that settled deep and made your hands shake. He wanted to scream, he wanted to punch something, but instead he just kept walking toward the exit, boots echoing across that perfect marble floor. And that's when he saw it. He wasn't trying to look. He was just passing through the main display area, head down, trying to get out before anyone noticed how badly that interview had gone. But something caught his eye. A car. Not just any car, the centerpiece of the entire showroom. A brand new luxury supercar sitting on a rotating platform beneath a spotlight, gleaming like a jewel. Sleek black body, scissor doors, the kind of machine that costs more than most people's houses. A small gold placard beside it read, "Flagship model, $1.2 million." Mason slowed. He didn't mean to stop, but something felt wrong. He stepped closer, squinting at the car's undercarriage. The platform was rotating slowly, giving him a view of the chassis, the suspension, the brake assembly. And there it was, a hairline fracture in the brake caliper housing. Mason's breath caught. It was small, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, but it was there. A manufacturing defect, the kind of flaw that wouldn't cause problems immediately. But after a few thousand miles under heavy braking, the housing would fail. And when it did, the driver would lose hydraulic pressure. No brakes. At high speed. Someone was going to die in this car. Mason glanced around. Nobody was paying attention to him. The salespeople were busy with clients. The receptionists were answering calls. He stepped closer to the platform, crouching slightly to get a better look. "Excuse me, what are you doing?" Mason straightened. A young technician in a Silvercrest uniform stood a few feet away, frowning. "There's a defect," Mason said quietly, pointing. "In the brake assembly." The technician blinked. "What?" "The caliper housing. There's a fracture. Small, but it's there." The technician stepped closer, squinting where Mason pointed. His frown deepened. "I don't see anything." "It's a stress fracture," Mason explained. "Probably happened during manufacturing. You wouldn't catch it unless you were looking for it. But it's going to fail." The technician looked at Mason like he'd just claimed the car was haunted. "Are you a technician?" "Yes." "Here?" "No, Then maybe you should leave the diagnostics to the professionals." The word stung. But before Mason could respond, another voice cut through the showroom. "What's going on?" Mason turned, and for the second time that morning, the entire world seemed to tilt. A woman stood 10 feet away, arms crossed, watching them both with sharp, curious eyes. She was young, late 20s, maybe 30, tall and composed, dressed in a charcoal blazer and tailored pants that somehow looked effortless. Her dark hair was pulled back in a low ponytail, no jewelry except a simple silver watch. She didn't look like the other employees, too polished, too certain. She looked like someone who owned things. The technician straightened immediately. "Miss Vale, I'm sorry. This man was just... What is just this?" I heard what he said. Her eyes shifted to Mason. "You think there's a defect in the car?" Mason hesitated. This wasn't his problem. He didn't work here. He'd already been humiliated once today. The smart thing to do was apologize, walk away, and never come back. But he thought about that fracture, about some wealthy driver hitting the brakes at 90 miles per hour on a coastal highway, and realizing, too late, that nothing was happening. So instead of walking away, Mason nodded. "Yes, ma'am. In the brake caliper housing. It's a stress fracture, hard to see, but it's there." The woman studied him for a long moment. Then she looked at the technician. "Open the bay. I want to see it." The technician's face went pale. "Ms. Vale, I really don't think—" "I didn't ask what you think." Her voice was calm but absolute. "Open the bay." The technician swallowed and hurried off. The woman turned back to Mason. "What's your name?" "Mason Ryder." "You work here?" "No, ma'am. I was just interviewing." Her eyebrow arched slightly. "For what position?" "Technician." She glanced down at his boots, his jacket, then back at his face. "And how did that go?" Mason almost laughed. "Not great." "Clearly." She tilted her head. But you know enough to spot a defect nobody else saw. I've been working on cars my whole life. Where? Lou's Auto Repair, East Side. Recognition flickered in her eyes. Not of the shop, but of the neighborhood. The kind of place people only went when they couldn't afford anywhere else. And before that? Mason hesitated. Different places. She didn't push, just nodded slowly, still watching him like she was solving a puzzle. Come with me, she said. Ma'am? You claim there's a defect. Prove it. She turned and walked toward the service bay without waiting to see if he'd follow. Mason stood there for a second, heart pounding. Then he followed her. The service bay was massive, 3 times the size of Lou's entire garage. Hydraulic lifts, diagnostic computers, tool chests that probably cost more than Mason's car. Everything gleamed under fluorescent lights. The technician was already there, looking nervous. 2 other employees hovered nearby, whispering. The woman, Ms. Vale, gestured to the car, which had been moved into the bay. Show me. Mason walked over, crouched beside the rear wheel, and pointed. There. See the caliper housing? Right along the seam. The lead technician crouched beside him, squinting. For a long moment, nobody said anything. Then the technician's face went white. Oh my God. He stood quickly, pulling out a flashlight, getting a closer look. His hands were shaking. How did we miss this? It's small, Mason said quietly. Easy to overlook if you're not checking for stress fractures specifically. The technician looked at Ms. Vale. He's right. It's a manufacturing defect. If someone drove this car hard, he trailed off, face grim. Ms. Vale didn't react. She just stood there, arms still crossed, staring at the car like it had personally betrayed her. Then she looked at Mason. You just saved this company from a lawsuit, maybe worse. Mason shrugged. I just saw something that didn't look right. Most people wouldn't have noticed. Most people don't spend their lives under cars. A faint smile touched her lips, not warm, but real. What's your background, Mr. Ryder? Automotive engineering. I used to work in racing. Her eyes sharpened. Racing? Long time ago. Which team? Mason hesitated again. This was the part he didn't talk about, the part that came with questions he didn't want to answer, but something about the way she was looking at him, not with pity, not with judgment, just with genuine curiosity, made him answer honestly. Apex Performance, he said quietly. I was their lead engineer for 3 years. The room went silent. Even the technicians stopped moving. Apex Performance wasn't just any racing team. They were a dynasty. 5 consecutive championships, millions in sponsorships, the kind of operation that attracted the best engineers in the world. And Mason had been one of them. Ms. Vale's expression shifted, still composed, but something flickered behind her eyes. Surprise. Maybe respect. You worked for Apex. Yeah. Why'd you leave? The question landed hard. Mason looked down at his hands. Grease still clung to the edges of his fingernails, no matter how hard he scrubbed. My wife got sick, he said quietly. I had a daughter. Racing schedules don't leave much room for family, so I walked away. And your wife? She died 2 years ago. The words came out flat, emotionless. He'd said them so many times they didn't even hurt anymore. Just a fact, like saying the sky was blue. Ms. Vale's face softened, just slightly. I'm sorry. Mason nodded. She glanced at the car again, then back at him. Wait here. She walked out of the bay, leaving Mason standing there with a room full of technicians staring at him like he'd just walked out of a legend. One of them, a younger guy, maybe 25, leaned over. You really worked for Apex? Yeah. Holy shit. Mason didn't respond. He just stood there, feeling the weight of a life he used to have pressing down on his chest. 5 minutes later, Ms. Vale returned, and she wasn't alone. Derek Calloway walked beside her, his expression tight and furious. Vanessa, this is absurd. It's not, she said calmly. And you're going to apologize. Calloway's jaw clenched. For what? She stopped walking and turned to face him fully. For wasting this man's time. For dismissing him before you even bothered to learn who he was. And for almost letting $1 million death trap roll off this lot because you were too arrogant to listen. Calloway's face flushed red. I was doing my job. No, Vanessa said coldly. You were protecting your ego. She looked at Mason. Mr. Ryder, I owe you an apology. On behalf of Silvercrest Motors, I'm sorry for how you were treated today. Mason blinked. Ma'am, you don't have to. Yes, I do. She paused. And I'd like to offer you a job. The room went completely still. Mason stared at her. What? Not the position you applied for, Vanessa continued. Something better. I want you to oversee our technical operations. Inspect every vehicle before it leaves this lot. Work with our performance consulting team. Clients who buy cars like this, they want someone who actually knows what they're talking about, not just someone who can smile and read a script. Mason's heart was pounding so hard he could barely hear her. I don't understand. It's simple, Vanessa said. You have a skill set this company desperately needs, and I'm willing to pay you what you're worth. What's the salary? She named a number. Mason's knees almost buckled. It was more than double what he'd been making at Lou's. Enough to cover rent, daycare, groceries, everything, with money left over. Enough to stop living one disaster away from homelessness. Enough to give Chloe the life she deserved. But even as relief flooded through him, something else stirred. A quiet, familiar fear. Because he'd had success before. He'd had money, status, a career people envied, and he'd lost everything anyway. Can I think about it? Mason heard himself say. Vanessa's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Understanding, maybe. Of course. Take the night. Call me tomorrow. She handed him a business card. Mason took it, fingers numb. And as he walked out of that dealership, back into the cold October air, he realized something terrifying. For the first time in 2 years, he had hope. And hope was the most dangerous thing a broken man could carry. Mason didn't go straight home. He sat in his car for 20 minutes in that crumbling parking lot 3 blocks from Silvercrest, staring at Vanessa Vale's business card like it might disappear if he blinked. The engine was off. The heat wasn't running. His breath fogged the windshield, but he barely noticed the cold. The number she'd quoted kept echoing in his head. Enough money to stop choosing between electricity and groceries. Enough to get Chloe new shoes that actually fit instead of stuffing cardboard in the ones that were too big. Enough to stop lying every time she asked if they were going to be okay. But the fear was there too, coiled tight in his chest. He'd walked away from success once before. Walked away from Apex Performance. From the money and the prestige and the life everyone told him he was crazy to leave. And he'd done it because racing had turned him into a ghost in his own home. Always traveling, always working, always choosing the next race over the people who needed him. His wife had gotten sick while he was in Monaco celebrating a championship. By the time he flew home, the cancer had already spread. He'd quit 2 weeks later. And he swore he'd never let ambition steal time from Chloe the way it had stolen time from Emma. So now, sitting in a freezing car with a business card that represented everything he thought he'd left behind, Mason felt paralyzed. What if taking this job meant becoming that person again? What if Silvercrest consumed him the same way racing had? What if he looked up one day and realized Chloe had grown up while he was too busy working to notice? His phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Kowalski. Chloe's asking when you're coming back. Everything okay? Mason exhaled slowly, shoved the business card in his jacket pocket, and started the car. When he picked Chloe up 20 minutes later, she was sitting on Mrs. Kowalski's couch, watching cartoons and eating animal crackers. The second she saw him, she jumped up and ran over, her small arms wrapping around his legs. "Daddy!" He crouched down and hugged her tight, breathing in the faint smell of strawberry shampoo and sugar cookies. "Hey, sweetheart. Did you get the job?" Her eyes were so bright, so hopeful, it almost broke him. "I don't know yet," he said carefully. "They said they'd call me." It wasn't exactly a lie. Chloe's face fell a little, but she nodded like she understood. She was good at that, understanding things a 6-year-old shouldn't have to understand. "It's okay, Daddy. You'll get the next one." Mason kissed her forehead and stood, nodding his thanks to Mrs. Kowalski, who waved them off with the same tired, sympathetic smile she always wore. They drove home in silence, Chloe humming along to the radio while Mason's mind churned. That night, after dinner, boxed macaroni and cheese, the only thing left in the pantry, Mason sat on the edge of Chloe's bed while she colored in a dinosaur coloring book. "Daddy?" "Yeah?" "If you get a big job, Does that mean you'll be gone a lot? Mason's stomach twisted. What makes you ask that? She didn't look up from her drawing. Emma's dad got a big job last year. Now she only sees him on weekends. Emma was a girl from Chloe's daycare. Mason had met her father once, some finance guy who worked 80-hour weeks and bought his daughter's affection with toys she didn't need. That's not going to happen, Mason said quietly. Promise? He hesitated, because he wanted to promise. He wanted to tell her that no job, no amount of money would ever come between them. But he also knew how quickly promises could shatter. I promise I'll always do my best, he said finally, and you'll always come first, okay? Chloe looked up at him, studying his face with those serious, too-old eyes. Then she nodded. Okay. Mason kissed her goodnight, turned off the light, and closed the door softly behind him. He stood in the narrow hallway of their apartment, staring at the peeling wallpaper and the water stain spreading across the ceiling, and pulled out Vanessa Vale's business card again. He thought about Chloe's question. He thought about the eviction notice that would probably arrive in 2 weeks. He thought about the way Vanessa had looked at him in that service bay, not with pity, not with doubt, but with respect. And then he called her. She answered on the second ring. Vanessa Vale. Her voice was crisp, professional, like she'd been expecting the call. Ms. Vale, it's Mason Ryder. Mr. Ryder. A pause. I was hoping I'd hear from you. I've been thinking about your offer. And? Mason closed his eyes. I need to know something first. Go ahead. You said I could take time for my daughter, that she comes first. Did you mean that? There was a long silence on the other end. When Vanessa spoke again, her voice was quieter, more personal. My father built this company from nothing, she said. He worked 70-hour weeks, missed birthdays, holidays, every school event I ever had. And when he died 2 years ago, the only thing he left me was a business I didn't know how to run and a closet full of regrets. She paused. So yes, Mr. Ryder, I meant it. Mason's throat tightened. Then I'll take the job. Good. Her tone shifted back to business. Can you start Monday? Yeah? 9 o'clock. I'll have your contract ready. Thank you, Ms. Vale. Vanessa, she corrected, and you're welcome. She hung up. Mason stood there for a moment, heart pounding, the phone still pressed to his ear. Then he walked into Chloe's room, sat down on the edge of her bed, and gently shook her shoulder. Chloe, wake up, sweetheart. She stirred, blinking up at him groggily. Daddy? I got the job. For a second, she just stared at him, processing. Then she threw her arms around his neck and squeezed so hard he could barely breathe. Really? Really? She pulled back, grinning so wide it made his chest ache. Does that mean we can stay here? Yeah, baby, we can stay. She hugged him again, and Mason closed his eyes, letting himself feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. That weekend, Mason told Lou he wouldn't be coming back. The old man took it better than Mason expected. He just nodded, clapped Mason on the shoulder, and said, You deserve something better than this place, kid. Mason wanted to argue, to say Lou's shop had been the only thing keeping him afloat for the last 4 years, but Lou waved him off. Don't get sentimental. You're too good for this dump. You always were. On Monday morning, Mason dropped Chloe off at daycare wearing clothes he'd ironed the night before and shoes he'd polished until they almost looked new. She kissed him goodbye and whispered, Good luck, Daddy, before running off to play with the other kids. He arrived at Silvercrest 15 minutes early. The dealership looked just as intimidating as it had the first time, but now Mason wasn't a desperate stranger hoping for scraps. He was an employee. He had a contract. He had a purpose. Vanessa met him in the lobby, dressed in a navy blazer and white blouse, her expression calm and unreadable. Mr. Ryder, right on time. Yes, ma'am. She gestured for him to follow. They walked through the showroom, past the glossy sports cars and the salespeople already greeting early customers, and into a hallway lined with offices. Vanessa's office was at the end, a large corner room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. She sat down behind a sleek glass desk and slid a folder across to him. Your contract. Read it carefully. If you have questions, ask. Mason opened the folder and scanned the pages. The salary matched what she'd quoted. Health insurance, paid time off, a clause guaranteeing flexible hours for family emergencies. He looked up. This is more than fair. It's what you're worth. She leaned back in her chair. I don't believe in underpaying people and expecting loyalty. That's how you build resentment, not a team. Mason signed the contract and slid it back across the desk. Vanessa filed it away, then stood. Come on, I'll introduce you to the team. The technical staff worked in a large bay adjacent to the main showroom. There were 6 technicians in total, all of them older than Mason, all of them dressed in crisp Silvercrest uniforms. When Vanessa walked in with Mason, the conversation stopped. Everyone, this is Mason Ryder, Vanessa said. He'll be overseeing technical operations and performance consulting. Treat him with the same respect you'd show me. One of the technicians, a stocky man in his 50s with graying hair, stepped forward, extending a hand. Greg Mercer, lead technician. Mason shook his hand. Good to meet you. Greg studied him for a moment, then nodded. Heard you worked for Apex. Long time ago. Still counts. Greg glanced at the others. You find anything wrong with our work, you tell us. We'll fix it. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't hostile either. Just professional. Mason could work with that. Vanessa left him with Greg, who spent the next 2 hours walking Mason through the dealership's systems. Inventory tracking, diagnostic protocols, client records. It was overwhelming at first, but Mason absorbed it quickly. He'd always been good at learning on the fly. By lunchtime, Greg seemed cautiously impressed. You pick things up fast. Had a lot of practice. Greg leaned against a tool bench, arms crossed. Can I ask you something? Sure. Why'd you really leave Apex? Mason hesitated. Most people assumed he'd been fired, or that he'd burned out, or that he couldn't handle the pressure. Nobody ever guessed the truth, that he'd walked away willingly. My wife got sick, Mason said quietly. I had a daughter. Racing didn't leave room for both. Greg nodded slowly. That takes guts, walking away from something like that. Didn't feel like it at the time. It never does. They worked in silence for a while after that, inspecting a luxury sedan that had just arrived from the manufacturer. Mason found 2 minor issues, a misaligned door panel and a loose trim piece, and flagged them for correction before the car hit the showroom floor. Greg watched him work, saying nothing, but Mason could feel the evaluation happening. Around 3 o'clock, Vanessa appeared in the bay. Mr. Ryder. A moment? Mason followed her back to her office. She closed the door and gestured for him to sit. How's your first day? Good. Greg's been helpful. He's tough, but he's fair. If he respects you, the rest of the team will follow. She paused. I wanted to talk to you about something. Okay. Vanessa leaned forward slightly, her expression serious. This company is in trouble. Mason blinked. What kind of trouble? The financial kind. She sighed. My father built Silvercrest into one of the most respected dealerships in the state, but in the last 5 years, he got complacent, started chasing volume over quality, cut corners, hired people like Derek Calloway who care more about commissions than clients. She paused. When he died, he left me a company drowning in debt and bleeding customers. Why are you telling me this? Because I need you to understand what's at stake. Vanessa's gaze was steady. I'm not just trying to save a business. I'm trying to save my father's legacy, and I can't do that with a team that treats this place like a paycheck. Mason studied her. She was younger than most of the people running companies like this. Younger than him, even. But there was something in her eyes, something hard and determined, that reminded him of the drivers he used to work with, the ones who refused to lose no matter how bad the odds looked. What do you need from me? Mason asked. Honesty. I need someone who'll tell me when something's wrong instead of covering it up to avoid conflict. I need someone who understands that reputation is built one car at a time. She paused. And I need someone who won't let me make the same mistakes my father did. Mason nodded slowly. I can do that. Good. Vanessa stood. Because we've got our first test tomorrow. What's happening tomorrow? A client, big buyer, he's considering a fleet purchase, 12 luxury vehicles for his company's executive team. If we close this deal, it keeps us solvent for the next 6 months. Her expression tightened. If we don't, I'll have to start laying people off. Mason's stomach sank. No pressure then. Vanessa almost smiled. Welcome to Silvercrest, Mr. Ryder. That night, Mason picked Chloe up from daycare and took her to the grocery store, something they hadn't done in months. He let her pick out her favorite cereal, the expensive kind with the cartoon characters on the box. He bought fresh vegetables instead of canned. He even splurged on ice cream. At the checkout, when the total came to $73, Mason didn't flinch. Chloe noticed. "Daddy, are you sure we can afford all this?" He crouched down, meeting her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart, we're okay now." She grinned and hugged him right there in the middle of the store. And Mason didn't care that people were staring. The next morning, Mason arrived at Silvercrest 30 minutes early. He wanted to inspect the vehicles before the client arrived. 12 luxury sedans, all identical, all prepped and staged in the showroom. They looked perfect, gleaming paint, spotless interiors, not a scratch or smudge anywhere. But Mason had learned a long time ago that perfect was usually a lie. He spent the next hour going over each car, checking fluid levels, testing electronics, inspecting brake assemblies. 11 of them were flawless. The 12th had a problem. It was subtle. A faint grinding noise when he tested the steering column. Most people wouldn't notice it, but Mason did. He flagged Greg immediately. "We've got an issue." Greg frowned. "What kind of issue?" "Steering column on Unit 12. There's a grinding noise. Could be a loose bearing." Greg tested it himself, then swore under his breath. "How the hell did we miss that?" "Doesn't matter. We need to fix it before the client gets here. Client's arriving in an hour." "Then we've got an hour." They pulled the car into the bay and tore into the steering column. It was a loose bearing, just like Mason suspected. Fixable, but not fast. 45 minutes later, they were still working when Vanessa appeared in the bay. "Is there a problem?" Mason didn't look up from the steering column. "Found a defect. We're fixing it. The client's going to be here in 10 minutes. Then we'll be done in 9. Vanessa watched them work for a moment, then left without another word. Mason and Greg finished with 3 minutes to spare. They rolled the car back into the showroom, wiped it down, and stepped back just as a sleek black limousine pulled up outside. The client was a man in his 60s. Silver hair, tailored suit, the kind of presence that filled a room the second he walked in. Derek Calloway greeted him with an oily smile and a handshake that lasted too long. Mason stayed in the background, watching. The client inspected the cars methodically, asking technical questions that Calloway fumbled through with vague, rehearsed answers. Mason could see the client's interest fading with every non-answer. Then Vanessa stepped in. "Mr. Harmon, this is Mason Ryder. He oversees our technical operations. If you have specific questions about performance or engineering, he's the person to ask." Harmon turned to Mason, eyes sharp. "You're the technician?" "Yes, sir." "What's your background?" "Automotive engineering. I worked for Apex Performance for 3 years. Harmon's eyebrows rose. "Apex, impressive." He gestured to one of the cars. "Walk me through the suspension system." Mason didn't hesitate. He explained the adaptive damping, the independent rear suspension, the anti-roll technology, all of it in plain language that Harmon could understand without talking down to him. Harmon listened carefully, nodding occasionally, asking follow-up questions. When Mason finished, Harmon looked at Vanessa. "I'll take all 12. Calloway's face lit up. But Harmon wasn't finished. "On one condition. I want Mr. Ryder personally inspecting every vehicle before delivery." Vanessa didn't hesitate. "Done." Harmon smiled. "Then we have a deal." They shook hands. As Harmon left, Calloway's smile disappeared. He shot Mason a look of pure venom before stalking off toward his office. Vanessa turned to Mason. "You just saved this company 6 months of breathing room." Mason shrugged. "I just answered his questions." "No." Vanessa's gaze was steady. "You treated him like someone worth being honest with. That's what made the difference." She walked away before Mason could respond. Over the next 2 weeks, Mason settled into a rhythm at Silvercrest. He arrived early, stayed late, and threw himself into the work with a focus he hadn't felt in years. The other technicians warmed up to him gradually, respecting the way he worked without ego or shortcuts. But it was Vanessa who surprised him. She didn't hover or micromanage. She trusted him to do his job. But she also made time to check in, not as a boss, but as someone genuinely interested in how things were going. One evening, after most of the staff had left, Mason was finishing up an inspection when Vanessa appeared in the bay. "Still here?" He glanced up. "Just wrapping up?" She leaned against a workbench, watching him. "You don't have to work this late every night." "I know." So why do you? Mason wiped his hands on a rag. Because I want to make sure we get it right. Vanessa studied him for a moment. Your daughter, how old is she? 6. What's her name? Chloe. And she's okay with you working late? Mason hesitated. She doesn't complain, but I try not to make it a habit. Vanessa nodded slowly. My father used to work late every night. He'd tell me it was temporary, that once the company was stable, he'd slow down. She paused. He never did. I'm not your father. I know. Her voice was quiet. But I also know how easy it is to let work consume you when you're good at it. Mason looked at her. Is that what happened to you? She smiled faintly. I wouldn't be here at 8 o'clock at night if it wasn't. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Vanessa pushed off the workbench. Go home, Mr. Ryder. Your daughter's waiting. What about you? I've got a few more things to finish. Mason grabbed his jacket. For what it's worth, I think you're doing a good job. Vanessa looked surprised. Thank you. He nodded and left. But as he drove home that night, he couldn't stop thinking about the way she'd looked when she talked about her father, like she was carrying a weight she didn't know how to put down. He understood that feeling. When Mason got home, Chloe was already asleep on the couch, curled up under a blanket with her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. Mrs. Kowalski sat in the armchair nearby, knitting quietly. She tried to wait up for you, Mrs. Kowalski said softly. But she was too tired. Mason crouched beside the couch and brushed Chloe's hair back gently. Thanks for watching her. Any time, dear. After Mrs. Kowalski left, Mason carried Chloe to her bed and tucked her in. She stirred slightly, mumbling something he couldn't make out, then settled back into sleep. He stood there for a long time, watching her breathe, feeling the quiet weight of everything he was trying to build for her. And for the first time in 2 years, he let himself believe it might actually work. 3 weeks into the job, Mason started noticing the cracks. Not in the cars, those he could fix, but in the people running Silvercrest, in the systems holding the company together. Small things at first. A salesperson promising a delivery date the service team couldn't meet. Inventory records that didn't match what was actually in the lot. Client complaints that got buried instead of addressed. And Derek Calloway, always hovering at the center of it like an infection nobody wanted to acknowledge. Mason kept his head down and focused on his work. It wasn't his job to fix company politics. He was there to inspect vehicles, consult with clients, and make sure nothing dangerous left the lot. That was it. But Vanessa kept pulling him into conversations that went beyond technical specs. One afternoon, she called him into her office and closed the door. I need your opinion on something. Mason sat down across from her. Okay? She slid a folder across the desk. Financial reports, sales projections. Numbers. Mason barely understood. We're losing money on our service contracts, Vanessa said. Calloway's been pushing them hard because they look good on paper, high volume, recurring revenue, but the margins are terrible. We're spending more on parts and labor than we're charging clients. Mason scanned the numbers. Why? Because Calloway negotiated rates 3 years ago and never adjusted for inflation or increased supplier costs. She leaned back in her chair, frustrated. He's so focused on closing deals that he's not looking at whether those deals actually make sense. So fire him. Vanessa's laugh was sharp and humorless. I wish it were that simple. Calloway's been here since my father started the company. Half the sales team is loyal to him. If I fire him, they'll walk. And if they walk, we lose the relationships they've built with clients. She paused. I can't afford a mass exodus right now. Mason set the folder down. So what are you going to do? I don't know yet. She looked tired. But I wanted your take. You've worked in high-pressure environments before. How did Apex handle people who were hurting the team? Mason thought about it. They didn't tolerate it. If someone wasn't pulling their weight or causing problems, they were gone. No exceptions. He paused. But racing's different. Everyone's replaceable. You've got 100 engineers waiting for a shot. You don't have that luxury here. No, Vanessa said quietly. I don't. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Mason said something he hadn't planned to say. You need to make a choice. Either you trust that the company's strong enough to survive without Calloway, or you accept that he's going to keep dragging you down. He met her eyes. But you can't do both. Vanessa studied him. You're blunt. You asked for my opinion. I did. She smiled faintly. Thank you. Mason stood to leave, but Vanessa's voice stopped him. Mr. Ryder? He turned. You're good at this. Not just the technical work. All of it. I'm just doing my job. No, Vanessa said. You're doing more than that. Mason didn't know how to respond, so he just nodded and left. But her words stayed with him. That weekend, Mason took Chloe to the park. It was the first Saturday in a month where he hadn't worked at least a half day, and Chloe was so excited she'd barely slept the night before. They spent the afternoon on the swings, chasing pigeons, eating hot dogs from a cart that probably wasn't up to health code standards, but tasted amazing anyway. At one point, Chloe looked up at him with mustard smeared across her chin and said, "Daddy, are you happy?" The question caught him off guard. What do you mean? You smile more now. She wiped her face with a napkin. You didn't used to smile a lot. Mason's chest tightened. Yeah, sweetheart, I'm happy. Good. She grabbed his hand. I like it when you're happy. They walked home slowly, Chloe chattering about school and her friends, and a lizard she'd seen on the playground. Mason listened, really listened, and realized how much he'd missed just being present with her. Work was good. The money was good. But this was better. When they got back to the apartment, Chloe ran inside to grab her coloring books while Mason checked the mail. Bills, mostly, a flyer for a pizza place, and a letter from Chloe's school. He opened it. It was a notice about an upcoming parent-teacher conference. Nothing urgent, just a routine check-in. But the date was the same day Silvercrest had scheduled a major client event, a private showcase for VIP buyers that Vanessa had been planning for weeks. Mason stood in the hallway staring at the letter, feeling the old familiar pull. Work or family? He'd promised Chloe she'd always come first, but he also knew how much Vanessa was counting on that event going smoothly. He folded the letter and shoved it in his pocket, telling himself he'd figure it out later. Monday morning, Derek Calloway cornered Mason in the service bay. We need to talk. Mason looked up from the engine he was inspecting. About what? Calloway stepped closer, his voice low and tight. About you overstepping. Mason set down his tools. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't play dumb. You've been in Vanessa's office 3 times this week. You're a technician. You fix cars. You don't get to weigh in on company strategy. Mason straightened, meeting Calloway's glare. Vanessa asked for my opinion. I gave it. She's young. She doesn't know what she's doing yet. And you're taking advantage of that. I'm doing my job. No, Calloway said coldly. You're trying to climb the ladder by whispering in her ear. And I'm telling you right now, it's not going to work. Mason's jaw tightened. You done? Calloway leaned in. Stay in your lane, Ryder, or you'll regret it. He walked away before Mason could respond. Greg, who'd been working on the other side of the bay, came over. You okay? Yeah. Calloway's an asshole. Don't let him get to you. I won't. But Mason's hands were shaking. Not from fear, from anger. The kind that made him want to follow Calloway into his office and tell him exactly where he could shove his threats. Instead, Mason took a breath, picked up his tools, and got back to work. That evening, Vanessa found him in the bay again. Calloway came to see me today. Mason didn't look up. Yeah? He said you were being insubordinate, that you're undermining his authority with the sales team. Mason stopped working. And what do you think? Vanessa crossed her arms. I think Calloway's scared. He's been running this place like his own personal kingdom for years, and now someone's finally questioning his decisions. She paused. But I also need to know, are you trying to take his job? Mason turned to face her. No. Then what are you doing? Telling you the truth when you ask for it. That's it. Vanessa studied him for a long moment. Calloway thinks I'm too young to run this company. He thinks I'm going to fail and that he'll be the one to pick up the pieces. Her voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. He's wrong. I know. Do you? Yeah. Mason met her eyes. You're tougher than he thinks. Something shifted in Vanessa's expression. Not quite a smile, but close. Thank you. She left and Mason went back to work, but his mind was spinning. Calloway wasn't going to let this go. And sooner or later, Mason was going to have to decide how far he was willing to push back. The next week, everything came to a head. It started with a client complaint. A wealthy businessman named Richard Pemberton had purchased a luxury coupe 2 months earlier, and now he was demanding a refund because the car's navigation system kept malfunctioning. Callaway insisted it was user error. The client was just too stupid to figure out the interface. But when Mason inspected the vehicle, he found the real problem: a software glitch caused by a faulty update from the manufacturer. It wasn't the client's fault. It was the car's. Mason reported the issue to Vanessa, who immediately authorized a full system replacement at no cost to the client. Callaway was furious. "You're setting a precedent," he snapped during a staff meeting. "Every time a client whines about something, we're just going to throw money at them?" "We're going to fix legitimate problems," Vanessa said calmly. "That's what we should have been doing all along." "This is exactly what I was talking about," Callaway pointed at Mason. "You let him in here, and suddenly we're bending over backward for people who don't deserve it." "Mr. Pemberton bought $1 million car," Vanessa said. "He deserves a car that works." Callaway's face flushed red. "You're letting a grease monkey dictate policy now?" The room went silent. Mason's hands clenched under the table. Vanessa stood slowly, her expression ice cold. "Say that again." Callaway faltered. I just meant, you just insulted one of the most valuable members of this team because you're too arrogant to admit you were wrong." Vanessa's voice was quiet, but it cut like a blade. "Mr. Ryder found a defect you missed. He diagnosed a problem you dismissed, and he's done more to protect this company's reputation in 6 weeks than you've done in 6 years. Callaway's jaw worked, but no words came out. "Here's what's going to happen," Vanessa continued. "You're going to apologize to Mr. Ryder, and then you're going to start treating every member of this team with the respect they deserve, or you're going to find another job." The silence stretched. Finally, Callaway turned to Mason, his voice tight. "I apologize." It didn't sound sincere, but it was enough. Vanessa dismissed the meeting, and everyone filed out quickly, avoiding eye contact. Mason stayed behind. "You didn't have to do that." Vanessa looked at him. "Yes, I did." "He's going to hate me now." "He already hated you." She paused. "But now he knows I won't tolerate him treating people like garbage." Mason wanted to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. Vanessa's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and sighed. "I have a call. We'll talk later." She left, and Mason stood alone in the conference room trying to process what had just happened. Someone had stood up for him. Someone had seen what he brought to the table and refused to let it be diminished. It was such a small thing, but it felt enormous. That night, Mason sat at the kitchen table with Chloe's school letter in front of him. The parent-teacher conference was in 3 days, the same day as Silvercrest's VIP client event. He'd been avoiding the decision, hoping some solution would magically appear. But time was running out. He could ask Mrs. Kowalski to go to the conference. She wouldn't mind. Chloe's teacher knew her, but that wasn't the point. He'd promised Chloe she'd come first. Mason picked up his phone and texted Vanessa. "Need to talk to you tomorrow. It's important." Her response came 2 minutes later. "My office, 8 a.m. The next morning, Mason arrived early. Vanessa was already at her desk, reviewing spreadsheets. "What's going on?" Mason sat down. "I can't work the client event on Thursday." Vanessa looked up, surprised. "Why not?" "Chloe's got a parent-teacher conference. I need to be there." Vanessa set down her pen. "Can someone else go? A neighbor, maybe?" "Yeah, but I don't want someone else to go. I want to be there." Vanessa studied him. "This event is a big deal, Mr. Ryder. We've got 12 high-value clients coming in. They're expecting to meet the team, including you." "I know. And you're still choosing the conference?" "Yeah." Vanessa leaned back in her chair, and for a moment, Mason thought she was going to argue. Thought she was going to tell him he had to choose between the job and his daughter, but instead she nodded. "Okay." Mason blinked. "Okay? I told you when I hired you, your daughter comes first. I meant it." She paused. "We'll manage without you on Thursday." Relief flooded through him. "Thank you. Don't thank me. Just make sure you're there for her." Mason stood to leave, but Vanessa's voice stopped him again. "Mr. Ryder?" He turned. You're a good father. The words hit him harder than he expected. I'm trying. That's all anyone can do. On Thursday afternoon, Mason sat in a too-small chair in Chloe's classroom while her teacher, a kind woman named Ms. Patterson, talked about Chloe's progress. She was doing well in reading, struggled a little with math, but nothing concerning. She was social, made friends easily, and had a big imagination. She talks about you a lot, Miss Patterson said, smiling. She's very proud of you. Mason's throat tightened. I'm proud of her too. After the conference, he took Chloe out for ice cream. She got chocolate with sprinkles and talked non-stop about a project she was working on in art class. And the whole time, Mason felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. He'd made the right choice. When they got home that evening, Mason's phone buzzed with a text from Vanessa. Event went well. Clients asked about you, told them you'd be at the next one. Mason smiled and texted back. I will be. Her response came quickly. Good. And Mr. Ryder, yeah? I'm glad you were there for Chloe today. Mason stared at the message for a long time. Then he typed back. Me too. The following week, Vanessa called an emergency staff meeting. Everyone gathered in the conference room. Technicians, salespeople, administrative staff. Derek Calloway sat at the far end of the table, arms crossed, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Vanessa stood at the head of the table. I'll keep this brief. We've been contacted by a major automotive publication. They want to feature Silvercrest in an article about luxury dealerships redefining customer service. Murmurs rippled through the room. This is a huge opportunity, Vanessa continued, but it also means we're going to be under a microscope. Every interaction, every vehicle, every detail has to be flawless. She looked directly at Mason. Mr. Ryder, they specifically requested to interview you. Mason's stomach dropped. Me? They heard about the Harman deal, about how you personally inspected every vehicle and built a relationship with the client. They want to know how we're changing the industry standard. Mason felt everyone's eyes on him. I'm not good with interviews. You don't have to be good, Vanessa said. You just have to be honest. Calloway's voice cut through the room. This is a mistake. Vanessa's expression didn't change. Excuse me? Putting him in front of reporters. Calloway gestured at Mason. He's not polished. He doesn't know how to talk to press. This could backfire. Mr. Ryder knows how to talk to clients, Vanessa said evenly. That's what matters. Clients aren't reporters. No, Vanessa agreed, but reporters are smart enough to recognize authenticity when they see it. Calloway's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. The meeting ended, and as people filed out, Vanessa pulled Mason aside. You okay? Yeah, just nervous. Don't be. Just tell them what you do and why it matters. That's simple? That's simple. But as Mason walked back to the service bay, he couldn't shake the feeling that Calloway was planning something. And 2 days later, his suspicion was confirmed. Mason was in the middle of an inspection when Greg appeared, looking grim. We've got a problem. What kind of problem? Calloway just told the reporter you don't have the authority to speak on behalf of Silvercrest. Mason's hand stilled. What? He went behind Vanessa's back, told them you're just a technician, and that any interview should go through him as sales director. Mason's blood ran cold. Where's Vanessa? In a meeting with investors. She doesn't know yet. Mason stood, wiping his hands on a rag. Where's Calloway? His office? Mason crossed the dealership floor in long, furious strides. He didn't knock. Just opened Calloway's door and stepped inside. Calloway looked up, startled. What the hell do you think you're doing? Mason's voice was low and controlled. You don't get to sabotage me because you're scared. Calloway stood. Get out of my office. No? Mason stepped closer. You've been undermining Vanessa since the day she took over. You treat this company like it's yours, but it's not. And you're so busy protecting your ego that you can't see you're destroying everything her father built. Calloway's face flushed red. You don't know what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about. I've worked with people like you before. People who think loyalty means never being questioned. People who mistake fear for respect. Mason's voice hardened. But here's the thing. Vanessa's not afraid of you, and neither am I. You're making a mistake, Calloway said quietly. The only mistake I'm making is wasting time talking to you. Mason turned and walked out, his heart pounding. He found Vanessa in her office 20 minutes later. She was on the phone, but when she saw his expression, she ended the call. What happened? Mason told her everything. Vanessa listened without interrupting, her face growing colder with every word. When he finished, she stood. Where is he? His office. She walked out and Mason followed. Calloway was still at his desk when Vanessa opened the door. You and I need to talk. Calloway barely looked up. I'm busy. Then get unbusy. Vanessa's voice was ice. Because we're going to have a conversation about your future at this company. Calloway's head snapped up. Excuse me? You went behind my back. You tried to undermine a decision I made, and you've been poisoning this team for months. Vanessa's expression was calm, but her words were surgical. I've been patient because I didn't want to disrupt the team, but I'm done being patient. Calloway stood slowly. You can't fire me. Watch me. Half the sales team will walk if you do. Then they can walk. Vanessa's gaze didn't waver. Because I'd rather rebuild with people who respect what we're trying to do here than keep someone who's actively working against me. Calloway's face went pale. You're making a mistake. No, Vanessa said quietly. I'm fixing one. She turned to Mason. Mr. Ryder, can you escort Mr. Calloway out? Mason nodded. Calloway grabbed his jacket, his movement sharp and angry. You're going to regret this, he said to Vanessa. I doubt it. Mason walked Calloway to the door, watching as the man climbed into his car and drove away without looking back. When he returned to the showroom, the entire staff was buzzing. Word had already spread. Vanessa was back in her office, sitting behind her desk, staring at nothing. Mason knocked softly. You okay? She looked up, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked uncertain. I just fired the longest-serving employee this company's ever had. He deserved it. I know. She exhaled slowly. But that doesn't make it easier. Mason sat down across from her. You did the right thing. Did I? Vanessa's voice was quiet. What if he's right? What if half the sales team walks? Then you hire people who actually want to be here. Vanessa looked at him. You make it sound simple. It's not simple, but it's necessary. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Vanessa smiled faintly. You're very good at this, you know. At what? Saying exactly what I need to hear. Mason shrugged. I just tell you the truth. I know. Vanessa's expression softened. That's why I trust you. The words hung in the air between them, and for the first time, Mason realized something he hadn't let himself think about. He trusted her too. The fallout from Calloway's firing was immediate and messy. 3 salespeople quit within 48 hours. 2 more threatened to leave unless Vanessa reconsidered. The showroom felt tense, conversations stopping abruptly whenever Vanessa walked past. Mason caught whispers in the service bay, fragments of doubt about whether the company could survive without Calloway's experience. But Vanessa didn't flinch. She conducted exit interviews with the departing staff, thanked them for their service, and started interviewing replacements the same week. She worked 16-hour days, taking over Calloway's client relationships personally, while simultaneously trying to keep the remaining team from falling apart. Mason watched her move through the dealership like someone who'd made peace with drowning, as long as she could pull the company up with her. On the 4th day after Calloway left, Mason found Vanessa in her office at 9 o'clock at night, surrounded by stacks of personnel files and half-eaten takeout containers. He knocked on the open door. She looked up, exhausted. Mr. Ryder, shouldn't you be home? Probably, but I saw your light on. Vanessa gestured to the chair across from her. Come to tell me I made a mistake? No. Mason sat down. Come to tell you that you need to eat something that isn't 3-day-old Chinese food. A faint smile touched her lips. It's only 2 days old. Still doesn't count as dinner. She set down her pen and leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. I forgot what it feels like to sleep more than 4 hours a night. Your dad used to do this too, didn't he? Vanessa nodded slowly. Every time there was a crisis, he'd lock himself in this office and work until he solved it. Or until he collapsed. She paused. I swore I wouldn't be like him, but here I am. You're not like him. How do you know? Because you actually care about the people working for you. Your dad might have built this place, but he didn't build it for anyone except himself. Mason met her eyes. You're trying to save something bigger than just your own legacy. Vanessa looked at him for a long moment. Thank you. For what? For reminding me why I'm doing this. Mason stood. Get some sleep, Vanessa. The company will still be here tomorrow. She smiled. I'll try. But when Mason left 20 minutes later, her office light was still on. The Automotive Magazine interview happened the following week. The reporter was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s named Lauren Cho, who arrived with a photographer and a list of questions that made Mason's palms sweat. They set up in the service bay, cameras clicking while Mason tried to explain his process without sounding like an idiot. So you personally inspect every vehicle before it's sold? Lauren asked. Every one that goes through our performance division, yeah. And what are you looking for? Anything that doesn't meet the standard the client's paying for. Mason gestured to a luxury sedan on the lift behind them. These cars cost more than most people make in 5 years. If something's wrong, even something small, it's my job to catch it before it becomes their problem. That seems unusual for a dealership. It is. Why do you think Silvercrest does it differently? Mason thought about that. Because the owner actually cares. Most places, they just want to move inventory. Here, we're trying to build something that lasts. Lauren scribbled notes. You used to work for Apex Performance, correct? Yeah. That's a pretty significant career change. Racing team to car dealership. Mason's jaw tightened slightly. Different priorities. Can you elaborate? He hesitated, then decided honesty was easier than deflection. I had a daughter. Racing didn't leave room for being a father. So I left. Lauren's expression softened. That must have been difficult. It was necessary. She nodded and moved on to other questions, but Mason could tell that answer had landed harder than the others. After the interview wrapped, Vanessa walked Lauren and the photographer to their car. Mason stayed behind, relieved it was over. Greg came over, grinning. You didn't screw it up. Thanks for the vote of confidence. I'm serious. You sounded like you knew what you were talking about. I do know what I'm talking about. Yeah, but most people can't explain it without sounding like an asshole. Greg clapped him on the shoulder. You did good. When Vanessa returned, she found Mason cleaning his workspace. How do you think it went? I have no idea. Lauren seemed impressed. She's a reporter. She's supposed to seem impressed. Vanessa laughed. You're too hard on yourself. Mason shrugged. Old habit. That evening, Mason picked Chloe up from daycare and took her to the grocery store. It had become their Thursday ritual, walking the aisles together, Chloe picking out snacks while Mason mentally calculated whether they could afford the name brand cereal or should stick with generic. Except now, they could afford the name brand. They could afford fresh fruit and real juice and the fancy pasta Chloe liked. Mason still found himself checking prices out of habit, but the panic was gone. The math worked now. At the checkout, Chloe looked up at him. Daddy, can we get flowers? Mason glanced at the small display near the register, cheap bouquets wrapped in plastic. What for? For your friend. What friend? The lady from your work, Vanessa. Mason's heart skipped. Why would we get her flowers? Chloe shrugged. You talk about her a lot. I thought she might like them. Mason stared at his daughter, suddenly very aware of how transparent he'd become. I don't talk about her that much. Chloe gave him a look that said she didn't believe him. Mason sighed and grabbed a small bouquet of daisies. Fine, but you're giving them to her. Chloe grinned. The next day, Mason brought Chloe to work with him for an hour during lunch. Vanessa had mentioned she wanted to meet her, and Chloe had been asking non-stop to see where Daddy worked. The dealership was quieter than usual. Most of the sales team was out with clients. Chloe held Mason's hand tightly as they walked through the showroom, her eyes wide as she took in the gleaming cars. Wow, pretty cool, huh? Can we buy one? Mason laughed. Maybe someday. Vanessa met them in the lobby, and Mason felt his daughter's grip tighten. You must be Chloe, Vanessa said, crouching down to Chloe's level. I've heard a lot about you. Chloe looked at Mason, then back at Vanessa. I brought you flowers. She held out the bouquet, slightly crushed from being carried in her backpack. Vanessa's expression softened in a way Mason had never seen before. These are beautiful. Thank you. Chloe beamed. Vanessa gave them a quick tour of the dealership, showing Chloe the service bay and letting her sit in the driver's seat of a sports car that cost more than Mason's entire childhood home. Chloe peppered her with questions. What's your favorite color? Do you have any pets? And how fast can this car go? And Vanessa answered every single one with patience and genuine interest. At one point, while Chloe was distracted by the car's dashboard, Vanessa glanced at Mason. She's wonderful. Yeah, she is. She looks like you. Mason smiled. Poor kid. Vanessa's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than necessary, and Mason felt something shift in the air between them. Something unspoken but undeniable. Then Chloe called out, "Daddy, can I honk the horn?" And the moment passed. Later that afternoon, after Mason had dropped Chloe back at daycare, Greg pulled him aside. "So that's your daughter?" "Yep. She's cute." "Thanks." Greg grinned. "Vanessa likes her." She was being polite. "No, man. I've worked here for 12 years. I've never seen Vanessa talk to anyone like that. She actually smiled." Greg paused. "She likes you too, you know." Mason's stomach tightened. "It's not like that." "Sure it's not. Greg, I'm just saying, you're both single. You both work too much. You'd be good for each other." Mason didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. But Greg's words stayed with him. 2 weeks later, the article came out. It was a full feature, 6 pages, complete with photos of the dealership, the service bay, and a shot of Mason inspecting an engine that somehow made him look more competent than he felt. The headline read, "Redefining Luxury: How One Dealership is Changing the Industry Standard." Lauren Cho had written about Silvercrest's commitment to quality over volume, Vanessa's vision for the company, and Mason's role in rebuilding client trust. She'd quoted him directly several times, and to Mason's surprise, he didn't sound like an idiot. The response was immediate. The dealership's phone started ringing nonstop. Clients called asking specifically for Mason. Other dealerships reached out wanting to know how Silvercrest's inspection process worked. A luxury car manufacturer even contacted Vanessa about a potential partnership. Within a week, Silvercrest had more business than they could handle. Vanessa called an all-staff meeting to celebrate. "This is what happens when we do things right," she said, standing in front of the team. "This is what happens when we stop cutting corners and start caring about the people we serve." The room erupted into applause. Afterward, Vanessa pulled Mason aside. "This was because of you. It was because of all of us." "No," Vanessa said firmly. "This happened because you refused to compromise, because you showed people what integrity looks like." Mason didn't know what to say. Vanessa smiled. "I owe you a drink." "You don't owe me anything." "Then let me buy you one anyway." They went to a quiet bar downtown after work, the kind of place with dim lighting and worn leather booths. Vanessa ordered whiskey. Mason ordered beer. They talked about work at first, new hires, upcoming client events, plans for expanding the performance division. But as the conversation went on, it shifted into something more personal. Vanessa told him about her father, about the pressure of inheriting a company she'd never wanted, about the fear of failing and erasing everything he'd built. Mason told her about Emma, about the guilt of not being there when she got sick, about the terror of raising Chloe alone and wondering every day if he was screwing it up. They sat in that booth for hours, trading stories and silences, and somewhere along the way, Mason realized he hadn't talked to anyone like this since Emma died. When they finally left, it was past midnight. Vanessa walked him to his car, her hands shoved in her coat pockets against the cold. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For tonight, for listening. Any time." She smiled, and for a moment, Mason thought she might say something else, something bigger, but instead she just squeezed his arm gently and walked to her own car. Mason drove home in silence, his mind racing. The next few weeks blurred together in a haze of work and routine. Mason's days fell into a rhythm. Early mornings with Chloe, long shifts at the dealership, evenings spent helping her with homework or reading bedtime stories. The job was demanding, but it didn't consume him the way racing had. He made time for Chloe's school events, her playdates, the little moments that used to slip through the cracks. And somewhere in the middle of it all, he started to notice how often Vanessa found reasons to be in the service bay. She'd stop by to ask his opinion on something, or to check on a client issue, or sometimes just to talk. And every time she did, Mason felt that same pull, the one he'd been trying to ignore. One evening, after most of the staff had left, Vanessa appeared in the bay while Mason was finishing an inspection. You're here late again. Last car of the day. Mason wiped his hands on a rag. What about you? Paperwork. She leaned against a workbench. Do you ever get tired of it? Of what? Working. Always working. Mason thought about it. Sometimes, but it's better than the alternative. Which is? Not being able to provide for my daughter. Vanessa nodded slowly. You're a good father, Mason. It was the first time she'd used his first name. He looked up, surprised. Thanks. I mean it. Her voice was quiet. Chloe's lucky to have you. Mason set down his tools. Can I ask you something? Sure. Why are you really here? Right now, I mean. Vanessa hesitated. Honestly? Yeah. Because I like talking to you. She paused. You don't treat me like I'm fragile or incompetent or some kid playing dress-up in her father's company. You just treat me like a person. Mason's chest tightened. You are a person. I know, but most people forget that. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. Then Vanessa's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and sighed. I should go. Yeah, me too. But neither of them moved. Finally, Vanessa pushed off the workbench and headed for the door. She stopped in the doorway and looked back. Mason? Yeah? I'm glad you're here. She left before he could respond. Mason stood alone in the empty bay, heart pounding, trying to figure out what the hell he was supposed to do with the way he was starting to feel. The following Saturday, Silvercrest hosted its annual charity gala. It was a black tie event held at a luxury hotel downtown, designed to attract high-net-worth clients and raise money for local youth programs. Vanessa had been planning it for months, and she'd insisted Mason attend. It's part of the job, she'd said when he tried to decline. Clients want to meet the team. So Mason rented a cheap tuxedo that didn't quite fit, dropped Chloe off at Mrs. Kowalski's, and drove downtown feeling like an imposter. The ballroom was enormous. Crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, a full orchestra playing jazz standards. Wealthy people in expensive clothes mingled near the bar. Laugh. This response didn't load. Try again by chatting to Claude. You said part 4. Lưu ý. Viết 6.000 đến 6.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện và hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Part 4 lưu ý. Viết 6.000 đến 6.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện và hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc, kẻ theo ngôi thứ ba. Giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình. Viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sang. Có yếu tố con người, cầm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo. Kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau, câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document. Chi đàn bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyện. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí, không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Show more 10. 03. Claude responded. Part 4. The fallout from Callaway's firing was immediate and messy. 3 salespeople quit within 48 hours. 2 more threatened to leave unless Vanessa reconsidered. The showroom felt tense, conversation stopping abruptly whenever Vanessa walked past. Mason caught whispers in the service bay, fragments of doubt about whether the company could survive without Callaway's experience. But Vanessa didn't flinch. She conducted exit interviews with the departing staff, thanked them for their service, and started interviewing replacements the same week. She worked 16-hour days taking over Callaway's client relationships personally while simultaneously trying to keep the remaining team from falling apart. Mason watched her move through the dealership like someone who'd made peace with drowning as long as she could pull the company up with her. On the 4th day after Callaway left, Mason found Vanessa in her office at 9 o'clock at night, surrounded by stacks of personnel files and half-eaten takeout containers. He knocked on the open door. She looked up, exhausted. "Mr. Ryder, shouldn't you be home?" "Probably, but I saw your light on." Vanessa gestured to the chair across from her. "Come to tell me I made a mistake?" "No." Mason sat down. "Come to tell you that you need to eat something that isn't 3-day-old Chinese food." A faint smile touched her lips. "It's only 2 days old." "Still doesn't count as dinner." She set down her pen and leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. "I forgot what it feels like to sleep more than 4 hours a night." "Your dad used to do this too, didn't he?" Vanessa nodded slowly. "Every time there was a crisis, he'd lock himself in this office and work until he solved it, or until he collapsed." She paused. "I swore I wouldn't be like him, but here I am." "You're not like him." "How do you know?" "Because you actually care about the people working for you. Your dad might have built this place, but he didn't build it for anyone except himself." Mason met her eyes. "You're trying to save something bigger than just your own legacy." Vanessa looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you." "For what?" "For reminding me why I'm doing this." Mason stood. "Get some sleep, Vanessa. The company will still be here tomorrow." She smiled. "I'll try." But when Mason left 20 minutes later, her office light was still on. The Automotive Magazine interview happened the following week. The reporter was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s named Lauren Cho, who arrived with a photographer and a list of questions that made Mason's palms sweat. They set up in the service bay, cameras clicking, while Mason tried to explain his process without sounding like an idiot. "So you personally inspect every vehicle before it's sold?" Lauren asked. "Every one that goes through our performance division? Yeah." "And what are you looking for?" "Anything that doesn't meet the standard the client's paying for." Mason gestured to a luxury sedan on the lift behind them. "These cars cost more than most people make in 5 years. If something's wrong, even something small, it's my job to catch it before it becomes their problem." "That seems unusual for a dealership." "It is." "Why do you think Silvercrest does it differently?" Mason thought about that. "Because the owner actually cares. Most places, they just want to move inventory. Here, we're trying to build something that lasts." Lauren scribbled notes. "You used to work for Apex Performance, correct?" "Yeah." "That's a pretty significant career change, racing team to car dealership." Mason's jaw tightened slightly. "Different priorities." "Can you elaborate?" He hesitated, then decided honesty was easier than deflection. "I had a daughter. Racing didn't leave room for being a father, so I left." Lauren's expression softened. "That must have been difficult." "It was necessary." She nodded and moved on to other questions, but Mason could tell that answer had landed harder than the others. After the interview wrapped, Vanessa walked Lauren and the photographer to their car. Mason stayed behind, relieved it was over. Greg came over, grinning. "You didn't screw it up." "Thanks for the vote of confidence." "I'm serious. You sounded like you knew what you were talking about." "I do know what I'm talking about." "Yeah, but most people can't explain it without sounding like an asshole." Greg clapped him on the shoulder. "You did good." When Vanessa returned, she found Mason cleaning his workspace. "How do you think it went?" "I have no idea." Lauren seemed impressed. "She's a reporter. She's supposed to seem impressed." Vanessa laughed. "You're too hard on yourself." Mason shrugged. "Old habit." That evening, Mason picked Chloe up from daycare and took her to the grocery store. It had become their Thursday ritual, walking the aisles together, Chloe picking out snacks while Mason mentally calculated whether they could afford the name brand cereal or should stick with generic. Except now, they could afford the name brand. They could afford fresh fruit and real juice and the fancy pasta Chloe liked. Mason still found himself checking prices out of habit, but the panic was gone. The math worked now. At the checkout, Chloe looked up at him. "Daddy, can we get flowers?" Mason glanced at the small display near the register, cheap bouquets wrapped in plastic. "What for?" "For your friend." "What friend?" "The lady from your work. Vanessa." Mason's heart skipped. "Why would we get her flowers?" Chloe shrugged. "You talk about her a lot. I thought she might like them." Mason stared at his daughter, suddenly very aware of how transparent he'd become. "I don't talk about her that much." Chloe gave him a look that said she didn't believe him. Mason sighed and grabbed a small bouquet of daisies. Fine, but you're giving them to her? Chloe grinned. The next day, Mason brought Chloe to work with him for an hour during lunch. Vanessa had mentioned she wanted to meet her, and Chloe had been asking non-stop to see where Daddy worked. The dealership was quieter than usual. Most of the sales team was out with clients. Chloe held Mason's hand tightly as they walked through the showroom, her eyes wide as she took in the gleaming cars. Wow. Pretty cool, huh? Can we buy one? Mason laughed. Maybe someday. Vanessa met them in the lobby, and Mason felt his daughter's grip tighten. You must be Chloe, Vanessa said, crouching down to Chloe's level. I've heard a lot about you. Chloe looked at Mason, then back at Vanessa. I brought you flowers. She held out the bouquet, slightly crushed from being carried in her backpack. Vanessa's expression softened in a way Mason had never seen before. These are beautiful, thank you. Chloe beamed. Vanessa gave them a quick tour of the dealership, showing Chloe the service bay and letting her sit in the driver's seat of a sports car that cost more than Mason's entire childhood home. Chloe peppered her with questions. What's your favorite color? Do you have any pets? How fast can this car go? And Vanessa answered every single one with patience and genuine interest. At one point, while Chloe was distracted by the car's dashboard, Vanessa glanced at Mason. She's wonderful. Yeah, she is. She looks like you. Mason smiled. Poor kid. Vanessa's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than necessary, and Mason felt something shift in the air between them, something unspoken but undeniable. Then Chloe called out, Daddy, can I honk the horn? And the moment passed. Later that afternoon, after Mason had dropped Chloe back at daycare, Greg pulled him aside. So that's your daughter? Yep. She's cute. Thanks, Greg grinned. Vanessa likes her. She was being polite. No, man. I've worked here for 12 years. I've never seen Vanessa talk to anyone like that. She actually smiled. Greg paused. She likes you too, you know. Mason's stomach tightened. It's not like that. Sure it's not. Greg, I'm just saying, you're both single. You both work too much. You'd be good for each other. Mason didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. But Greg's words stayed with him. 2 weeks later, the article came out. It was a full feature, 6 pages, complete with photos of the dealership, the service bay, and a shot of Mason inspecting an engine that somehow made him look more competent than he felt. The headline read, Redefining Luxury, How One Dealership is Changing the Industry Standard. Lauren Cho had written about Silvercrest's commitment to quality over volume, Vanessa's vision for the company, and Mason's role in rebuilding client trust. She'd quoted him directly several times. And to Mason's surprise, he didn't sound like an idiot. The response was immediate. The dealership's phone started ringing nonstop. Clients called asking specifically for Mason. Other dealerships reached out wanting to know how Silvercrest's inspection process worked. A luxury car manufacturer even contacted Vanessa about a potential partnership. Within a week, Silvercrest had more business than they could handle. Vanessa called an all-staff meeting to celebrate. This is what happens when we do things right, she said, standing in front of the team. This is what happens when we stop cutting corners and start caring about the people we serve. The room erupted into applause. Afterward, Vanessa pulled Mason aside. This was because of you. It was because of all of us. No, Vanessa said firmly. This happened because you refused to compromise. Because you showed people what integrity looks like. Mason didn't know what to say. Vanessa smiled. I owe you a drink. You don't owe me anything. Then let me buy you one anyway. They went to a quiet bar downtown after work, the kind of place with dim lighting and worn leather boots. Vanessa ordered whiskey. Mason ordered beer. They talked about work at first, new hires, upcoming client events, plans for expanding the performance division. But as the conversation went on, it shifted into something more personal. Vanessa told him about her father, about the pressure of inheriting a company she'd never wanted, about the fear of failing and erasing everything he'd built. Mason told her about Emma, about the guilt of not being there when she got sick, about the terror of raising Chloe alone and wondering every day if he was screwing it up. They sat in that booth for hours, trading stories and silences, and somewhere along the way, Mason realized he hadn't talked to anyone like this since Emma died. When they finally left, it was past midnight. Vanessa walked him to his car, her hands shoved in her coat pockets against the cold. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? For tonight. For listening. Any time. She smiled, and for a moment Mason thought she might say something else. Something bigger, but instead she just squeezed his arm gently and walked to her own car. Mason drove home in silence, his mind racing. The next few weeks blurred together in a haze of work and routine. Mason's days fell into a rhythm. Early mornings with Chloe, long shifts at the dealership, evenings spent helping her with homework or reading bedtime stories. The job was demanding, but it didn't consume him the way racing had. He made time for Chloe's school events, her play dates, the little moments that used to slip through the cracks. And somewhere in the middle of it all, he started to notice how often Vanessa found reasons to be in the service bay. She'd stop by to ask his opinion on something, or to check on a client issue, or sometimes just to talk. And every time she did, Mason felt that same pull, the one he'd been trying to ignore. One evening, after most of the staff had left, Vanessa appeared in the bay while Mason was finishing an inspection. "You're here late again. Last car of the day." Mason wiped his hands on a rag. "What about you?" "Paperwork." She leaned against a workbench. "Do you ever get tired of it?" "Of what?" "Working. Always working." Mason thought about it. "Sometimes. But it's better than the alternative." "Which is?" "Not being able to provide for my daughter." Vanessa nodded slowly. "You're a good father, Mason." It was the first time she'd used his first name. He looked up, surprised. "Thanks. I mean it." Her voice was quiet. "Chloe's lucky to have you." Mason set down his tools. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why are you really here? Right now, I mean." Vanessa hesitated. "Honestly?" "Yeah. Because I like talking to you." She paused. "You don't treat me like I'm fragile or incompetent or some kid playing dress-up in her father's company. You just treat me like a person." Mason's chest tightened. "You are a person." "I know, but most people forget that." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. Then Vanessa's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and sighed. "I should go." "Yeah, me too." But neither of them moved. Finally, Vanessa pushed off the workbench and headed for the door. She stopped in the doorway and looked back. "Mason?" "Yeah?" "I'm glad you're here." She left before he could respond. Mason stood alone in the empty bay, heart pounding, trying to figure out what the hell he was supposed to do with the way he was starting to feel. The following Saturday, Silvercrest hosted its annual charity gala. It was a black tie event held at a luxury hotel downtown, designed to attract high-net-worth clients and raise money for local youth programs. Vanessa had been planning it for months, and she'd insisted Mason attend. "It's part of the job," she'd said when he tried to decline. "Clients want to meet the team." So Mason rented a cheap tuxedo that didn't quite fit, dropped Chloe off at Mrs. Kowalski's, and drove downtown feeling like an imposter. The ballroom was enormous. Crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, a full orchestra playing jazz standards. Wealthy people in expensive clothes mingled near the bar, laughing at jokes Mason couldn't hear. He recognized a few clients from the dealership, but most of the faces were unfamiliar. Mason grabbed a drink from the bar and found a corner to stand in, hoping to disappear. Then he saw Vanessa. She was across the room wearing a simple black dress that somehow made everyone else look overdressed. Her hair was down for once, falling past her shoulders. She was talking to a group of investors, smiling that professional smile she wore when she was working. But when her eyes found Mason across the crowded ballroom, the smile changed, became real. She excused herself and walked over. "You came. You told me to." "I know, but I wasn't sure you would." Mason gestured at his ill-fitting tuxedo. "I clean up okay?" Vanessa's eyes swept over him, and something flickered in her expression. "You look good." Mason's throat went dry. "Thanks. So do you." Before either of them could say anything else, a server appeared with a tray of champagne. Vanessa grabbed 2 glasses and handed one to Mason. "Come on, I need to introduce you to some people." She led him through the crowd, introducing him to investors, board members, major clients. Mason shook hands and made small talk, trying not to feel like he was wearing someone else's life. But every time he glanced at Vanessa, she was watching him with something that looked like pride. Halfway through the evening, the MC called everyone to their seats for dinner. Mason found himself at Vanessa's table, surrounded by people who owned companies and vacation homes and probably didn't know what it felt like to choose between rent and groceries. The food was fancy, tiny portions arranged like art on oversized plates. Mason ate carefully, trying not to embarrass himself. Halfway through the main course, the man sitting across from Mason, a silver-haired investor named Richard, leaned forward. "So you're the engineer everyone's talking about." Mason set down his fork. "I wouldn't say everyone." Lauren Cho's article made quite an impression. "My wife's already asking when we can bring our car in for you to look at." "Anytime," Richard smiled. "Vanessa tells me you used to work for Apex Performance." "Long time ago." "Why'd you leave?" It was the same question everyone asked, and Mason still hated answering it. "Family reasons." Richard nodded like he understood, but Mason doubted he did. After dinner, the orchestra started playing again, and people drifted toward the dance floor. Mason stayed at the table, nursing his second drink and watching couples sway to music that sounded expensive. Vanessa appeared beside him. "You okay?" "Yeah, just not much of a dancer." She held out her hand. "Neither am I, but we should probably make an appearance." Mason hesitated. "Vanessa, one dance, then you can go hide in the corner again." He took her hand. They moved to the dance floor, and Mason tried to remember the last time he'd done this. Probably his wedding. Emma had loved dancing. She dragged him onto the floor at every opportunity, laughing when he stepped on her feet. The memory hurt, but not as much as it used to. Vanessa's hand settled on his shoulder, and Mason placed his hand on her waist, careful to keep a respectful distance. They swayed slowly to the music, neither of them quite in rhythm. "See?" Vanessa said. "Not so bad." "Speak for yourself. I'm counting steps in my head." She laughed. "So am I." They danced in silence for a moment. Then Vanessa said quietly, "Thank you for being here tonight." "It's my job." "No, it's more than that." She met his eyes. "You make this easier." "Make what easier?" "All of it. The pressure, the expectations, the fear that I'm going to fail and let everyone down." She paused. "When you're around, I feel like I can actually do this." Mason's heart was pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. "You can do this, with or without me." "I know, but it's better with you." The song ended and they stopped moving, standing in the middle of the dance floor while couples swirled around them. Mason should have stepped back, should have made a joke, broken the tension, reminded himself of all the reasons this was a bad idea, but he didn't. Instead, he said, "Vanessa." A commotion near the entrance cut him off. People were turning, murmuring, pointing toward the doors. And then Mason saw her, Chloe. Standing in the doorway in her pajamas, clutching her stuffed rabbit, tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Kowalski stood behind her, looking frantic and apologetic. Mason's entire body went cold. He crossed the ballroom in seconds, dropping to his knees in front of his daughter. "Chloe, what's wrong? What happened?" She threw her arms around his neck, sobbing. "I had a bad dream. You weren't there. I got scared." Mason held her tight, his heart breaking. "I'm here now, sweetheart. I'm right here." Mrs. Kowalski wrung her hands. "I'm so sorry, Mason." She woke up crying and wouldn't calm down. "She kept asking for you. I didn't know what else to do." "It's okay. You did the right thing." Vanessa appeared beside them, her expression concerned. "Is she all right?" Mason nodded, still holding Chloe. "Yeah, just scared." Vanessa crouched down, meeting Chloe's eyes. "Hi, Chloe. Remember me?" Chloe nodded, sniffling. "Do you want to sit with me and your dad for a little bit? We have cake." Chloe's eyes widened. "Cake? The really good kind." Chloe looked at Mason. "Can I, Daddy?" Mason's throat was tight. "Yeah, sweetheart, you can." They found a quiet corner of the ballroom, and a server brought over a slice of chocolate cake that Chloe attacked with the kind of enthusiasm only a 6-year-old could manage. Mason sat beside her, one arm around her shoulders, while Vanessa pulled up a chair across from them. "Better?" Vanessa asked. Chloe nodded, her mouth full of cake. "I like your dress." Vanessa smiled. "Thank you. I like your pajamas." Chloe grinned. They sat there for 20 minutes, Chloe chattering about her dream and her stuffed rabbit, and how Mrs. Kowalski's apartment smelled like old lady perfume. Mason barely said a word. He just watched his daughter slowly relax, her fear melting away as she stuffed herself with cake. And the whole time, Vanessa sat across from them, laughing at Chloe's stories, asking questions, treating her like she mattered. Eventually, Chloe's eyes started drooping. Mason scooped her up. I should get her home. Vanessa stood. Of course. I'm sorry. I know this was important. Mason. Vanessa's voice was firm. Don't apologize. She needed you. That's all that matters. Mason looked at her, holding his sleepy daughter against his chest, and felt something crack open inside him. Thank you. Vanessa smiled. Any time. As Mason carried Chloe toward the exit, she mumbled sleepily against his shoulder. Daddy? Yeah? I like Vanessa. Mason's chest tightened. Me too, sweetheart. Is she going to be my new mom? The question hit him like a punch. No, baby, she's just my friend. Oh, Chloe yawned. Okay. But as Mason walked out of that ballroom, past the wealthy investors and the crystal chandeliers and the life he'd accidentally stumbled into, he couldn't stop thinking about Vanessa's hand on his shoulder, her voice saying, "It's better with you," and the way Chloe had looked at her like she was someone safe. And for the first time since Emma died, Mason let himself wonder if maybe, just maybe, he was allowed to want something more than survival. The morning after the gala, Mason woke up to Chloe's small hand shaking his shoulder. Daddy, you're going to be late. He squinted at the clock. 7:15. He'd overslept. Thanks, sweetheart. She climbed onto the bed beside him, still holding her stuffed rabbit. Are you going to see Vanessa today? Mason rubbed his face, trying to wake up. Probably. Why? I want to make her a picture. What kind of picture? A thank you picture. For the cake. Mason's chest tightened. That's really nice of you. Chloe bounced off the bed and ran to grab her crayons. By the time Mason got to work an hour later, she'd drawn an elaborate scene of 3 stick figures standing next to what looked like a very tall cake. One figure had long dark hair, one had short hair and was slightly taller, and one was tiny, holding a rabbit. Mason folded the picture carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. The dealership was buzzing when he arrived. Several potential clients had called after seeing photos from the gala circulating online. Vanessa was in back-to-back meetings all morning. Mason caught glimpses of her through the glass walls of her office, always composed, always in control. But when their eyes met across the showroom around noon, she smiled, and Mason felt that same pull he'd been trying to ignore for weeks. Greg cornered him in the service bay during lunch. So, last night, Mason looked up from the engine he was inspecting. What about it? You and Vanessa, dancing. It was one dance. Yeah, but the way you were looking at her, Greg. I'm just saying, man, everyone saw it. Mason set down his tools. Saw what? That you two have a thing. We don't have a thing. Greg raised an eyebrow. You sure about that? Mason opened his mouth to argue, then stopped, because he wasn't sure. Not anymore. It's complicated, he said finally. It always is. Greg clapped him on the shoulder. But for what it's worth, I think you'd be good together. After Greg left, Mason stood alone in the bay, staring at nothing. He'd been telling himself for weeks that what he felt for Vanessa was just gratitude. She'd given him a job when he was desperate. She'd treated him with respect when everyone else looked at him like he was broken. Of course he appreciated that, but appreciation didn't explain why his heart raced every time she walked into a room. It didn't explain why he looked forward to their late-night conversations more than anything else in his day. And it definitely didn't explain why watching her crouch down to talk to Chloe at the gala had made him feel like someone had reached into his chest and squeezed. Mason pulled Chloe's drawing from his pocket and stared at the 3 stick figures. What the hell was he doing? That evening, just as Mason was finishing up, Vanessa appeared in the bay. Got a minute? Yeah, what's up? She handed him an envelope. Your bonus for the Harmon deal and the publicity from the article. Mason opened it. The check inside was more than he'd made in 2 months at Lou's garage. Vanessa, this is too much. No, it's not. You earned it. I was just doing my job. You saved this company. Her voice was quiet but firm. Twice. Once when you caught that brake defect, and again when you showed our clients what real expertise looks like. She paused. This is the least I can do. Mason looked at the check, then at her. Thank you. Vanessa nodded. There's something else I wanted to talk to you about. Okay. She hesitated, which was unusual for her. Vanessa didn't hesitate. I've been thinking about expanding, opening a second location, somewhere outside the city, targeting a different market. She met his eyes. And I want you to run it. Mason's heart stopped. What? You'd have full autonomy, build your own team, set your own standards. It would be your operation. Vanessa, I don't know the first thing about running a dealership. You know the most important thing, how to do it right. The rest you can learn. She paused. I trust you, Mason, more than anyone else I've ever worked with. Mason's mind was spinning. This was the kind of opportunity people spent their entire careers chasing, the kind of thing that could set up Chloe's future, pay for college, give them a life. Mason had stopped believing was possible, but it also meant more responsibility, more hours, more time away from Chloe. Can I think about it? Of course. Take as long as you need. She turned to leave, then stopped. Mason? Yeah? Last night, when Chloe showed up. Vanessa's voice was softer now. The way you dropped everything for her, the way you held her. She paused. That's the kind of person I want leading this expansion. Someone who understands what actually matters. She left before Mason could respond. He stood there holding the check and the weight of a decision he didn't know how to make. That night, after Chloe was asleep, Mason sat at the kitchen table with a beer he wasn't drinking and a pile of bills he'd already paid. His phone buzzed, a text from Vanessa. Did Chloe recover okay from last night? Mason smiled and typed back, Yeah. She made you a drawing. I'll bring it tomorrow. I'd love to see it. A pause. Then another message. Can I ask you something? Sure. Why haven't you gone back to racing? Mason stared at the question. He could have given her the easy answer, the one about priorities and family and choosing a different path. But something about the late hour and the quiet apartment and the way Vanessa had looked at him earlier made him tell the truth. Because I'm terrified I'll become the person I was before, the one who chose winning over everything else, the one who missed his wife getting sick because he was too busy celebrating a championship. He hit send before he could second guess it. Her response came quickly. You're not that person anymore. How do you know? Because that person wouldn't have left work to hold his daughter when she was scared. That person wouldn't have turned down overtime to make it to a parent-teacher conference. That person wouldn't be sitting at home on a Tuesday night worrying about whether he's good enough. Mason's throat tightened. Thanks. I mean it, Mason. You're one of the best men I've ever met. He stared at that message for a long time. Then he typed, You want to get coffee tomorrow? After work? The 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. I'd like that. They met at a small cafe 2 blocks from the dealership the next evening. It was the kind of place with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls and coffee that actually tasted good. Vanessa was already there when Mason arrived, sitting in a corner booth with 2 cups in front of her. I ordered for you. Black, right? Yeah. Mason slid into the booth across from her. How'd you know? I pay attention. They sat in silence for a moment, both of them suddenly nervous in a way they'd never been at work. Finally, Vanessa said, So, we're doing this. Doing what? Pretending this is just coffee between colleagues. Mason almost laughed. Yeah, I guess we are. Vanessa wrapped her hands around her cup. Can I be honest with you? Always. I'm terrified. Of what? Of this. Of whatever this is between us. She met his eyes. I'm your boss. You're an employee. If this goes wrong, it could destroy everything we've built. I know. And you have Chloe to think about. I don't want to be the reason things get complicated for her. Vanessa. But I also can't stop thinking about you. Her voice cracked slightly. And I don't know what to do with that. Mason's heart was pounding. I don't either. They stared at each other across the table. Then Vanessa said quietly, What do you want, Mason? It was such a simple question, but Mason hadn't let himself think about what he wanted in so long. Ever since Emma died, his entire life had been about survival, about making sure Chloe was okay, about keeping them fed and housed and stable. But sitting across from Vanessa, watching the way the late afternoon light caught in her hair, feeling the weight of everything unspoken between them, he knew what he wanted. I want to try, he said. I want to see if this could be something real, but I need you to understand, Chloe comes first, always. I know. And if this doesn't work, if it gets messy or complicated or starts affecting her, then we stop, Vanessa finished. I would never ask you to choose between me and your daughter. Mason nodded slowly. Okay. Okay? Yeah. He reached across the table and took her hand. Let's try. Vanessa's fingers curled around his, and for the first time in years, Mason felt like he was allowed to want something just for himself. They talked for 2 hours, the conversation flowing easily now that the truth was out in the open. Vanessa told him about the impossible standards her father had set, the constant pressure to prove she was good enough to carry his legacy. Mason told her about the guilt that still woke him up some nights, the fear that he'd failed Emma by not being there when she needed him most. And slowly, carefully, they began to understand each other in a way that went beyond work and professionalism and all the walls they'd both built to protect themselves. When they finally left the cafe, the sun was setting, painting the street in shades of orange and gold. Vanessa walked Mason to his car. So, what happens now? Mason smiled. I have no idea. That's comforting. We'll figure it out, one day at a time. Vanessa nodded. Then, before she could second-guess herself, she stood on her toes and kissed him. It was soft and brief and tasted like coffee. And when she pulled back, Mason's entire world had shifted. I've wanted to do that for weeks, she whispered. Mason's hand came up to cup her face. Me too. He kissed her again, slower this time, and felt something inside him that had been frozen for 2 years finally start to thaw. Over the next few months, they moved carefully. They didn't tell anyone at work. Not yet. They wanted to make sure it was real before making it public and dealing with the inevitable complications. But outside the dealership, they built something fragile and honest. Vanessa started joining Mason and Chloe for weekend trips to the park. At first, Chloe was shy, unsure how to navigate this new dynamic. But Vanessa was patient, never pushing, always letting Chloe set the pace. And slowly, Chloe started to warm up. She'd ask Vanessa to push her on the swings, or to help her color, or to read her bedtime stories when she stayed over at Mason's apartment on Friday nights. Mason watched it happen with a mixture of joy and terror. Because part of him loved seeing Chloe happy, seeing her bond with someone who genuinely cared about her. But another part of him was terrified that if this fell apart, it would break Chloe's heart all over again. One evening, after Vanessa had left and Chloe was getting ready for bed, his daughter looked up at him with serious eyes. Daddy? Do you love Vanessa? Mason's heart stopped. Why do you ask? Because you smile different when she's here, like you used to smile in the pictures with Mommy. Mason sat down on the edge of her bed. Would that be okay? If I did? Chloe thought about it. I think Mommy would want you to be happy. Mason's throat tightened. Yeah, I think she would too. So it's okay. Chloe paused. I like Vanessa. She's nice. And she doesn't treat me like a baby. Mason pulled her into a hug. I love you, sweetheart. I love you too, Daddy. The expansion project moved forward faster than Mason expected. Vanessa found a location 30 miles outside the city, a former luxury showroom that had gone bankrupt during the recession. It needed work, but the bones were solid. She brought Mason in on every decision, from hiring staff to designing the layout to setting service standards. And somewhere along the way, Mason realized he was actually good at this. Not just the technical work, but the leadership, the vision, the ability to see what a team needed and help them get there. 3 months after Vanessa first proposed the expansion, they held a soft opening for VIP clients. The new dealership was smaller than Silvercrest's flagship location, but it felt right. Clean lines, natural light, a service bay designed for precision and transparency. Everything Mason had learned over the past year built into a space that reflected his values. Vanessa stood beside him as the first clients walked through the doors. You did this, she said quietly. We did this. She smiled. Okay, we did this. The event was a success. Clients were impressed by the attention to detail, the personalized service, the fact that Mason personally walked them through every vehicle's inspection report. By the end of the night, they'd secured commitments for 8 sales. After everyone left, Mason and Vanessa stood in the empty showroom, exhausted and exhilarated. I can't believe we pulled this off, Vanessa said. I can. Mason looked at her. You're the most capable person I've ever met. She leaned against him, and Mason wrapped his arm around her shoulders. I couldn't have done it without you. Yeah, you could have. You just didn't have to. They stood there in comfortable silence, watching the streetlights flicker on outside. Then Vanessa said, Mason? Yeah? I love you. The words hung in the air between them. Mason's heart was pounding, but for once the fear didn't win. I love you too. She turned to face him and he kissed her like he'd been wanting to for months. Not tentatively, not carefully, but with the full weight of everything he'd been afraid to feel. When they finally pulled apart, Vanessa was crying. I didn't think I'd ever find this again, she whispered. After my father died, after I took over the company, I thought I'd just be alone, working until I burned out, just like he did. You're not alone. I know. She smiled through her tears. You gave me that. Mason cupped her face. You gave me something too. You gave me permission to want something more than just surviving. 6 months later, Silvercrest held its annual charity gala again. This time, Mason didn't rent a cheap tuxedo. He wore one Vanessa had insisted on buying him, tailored to actually fit. And this time, when he walked into that ballroom, he didn't feel like an imposter. Chloe came with them, wearing a new dress she'd picked out herself, and her hair done up in ribbons Mrs. Kowalski had spent an hour perfecting. She held Mason's hand on one side and Vanessa's on the other, beaming like she'd won the lottery. The gala was bigger than last year. More clients, more press, more people who wanted to shake Vanessa's hand and congratulate her on the expansion's success. But halfway through the evening, Vanessa stepped up to the podium to give her annual speech. The room quieted. Thank you all for being here tonight, she began. When my father built this company, he had a vision to create something that would outlast him, something that would matter. She paused, her eyes finding Mason in the crowd. But what he didn't understand, and what I'm only beginning to learn, is that a company isn't just buildings and cars and quarterly profits. It's people. It's the relationships we build, the trust we earn, the lives we touch. Vanessa's voice grew stronger. This past year, Silvercrest has grown in ways I never imagined. Not because we sold more cars or opened new locations, but because we stopped treating success as a zero-sum game. We started believing that doing the right thing and running a profitable business weren't mutually exclusive. She gestured to Mason. That shift started with one person, a man who walked into this dealership 6 months ago with nothing but expertise and integrity, who taught me that real leadership isn't about demanding respect, it's about earning it. Who showed me that you can build something extraordinary without sacrificing the people you love. The room erupted into applause. Mason felt his face flush. Vanessa waited for the noise to die down, then continued. I'm grateful to everyone here tonight, to our clients who trust us, to our staff who work tirelessly, to our partners who believe in our vision. She paused. But I'm especially grateful to Mason Ryder, who reminded me what it means to care about something bigger than yourself. More applause. And then, to Mason's complete shock, Chloe broke free from his hand and ran up to the stage. She climbed the stairs, her little dress bouncing, and threw her arms around Vanessa's waist. The entire ballroom went silent. Then someone started clapping, and then someone else. And within seconds, the entire room was on its feet, applauding a 6-year-old girl hugging a woman who'd become more than just her father's boss. Vanessa crouched down, hugging Chloe back, and when she looked up, there were tears streaming down her face. Mason stood frozen, watching his daughter and the woman he loved holding each other in front of 300 people, and felt something break open inside him. Not grief this time, joy. After the gala, they drove home together. The three of them crammed into Mason's old Honda because Vanessa's car was still parked at the hotel. Chloe fell asleep in the back seat, her head resting against her stuffed rabbit, her new dress rumpled and her ribbons coming loose. Vanessa reached over and took Mason's hand. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? For letting me be part of this. Part of your life, part of hers. Mason squeezed her hand. Thank you for wanting to be. When they got back to the apartment, Mason carried Chloe inside and tucked her into bed without waking her. Vanessa stood in the doorway, watching. She's lucky to have you, Vanessa whispered. I'm lucky to have her. They stood there for a moment, watching Chloe sleep. Then Vanessa said, Mason, I've been thinking about something. Yeah? What would you say if I asked you to move in with me? Mason's heart skipped. Seriously? Seriously, I know it's fast and I know it's complicated, but... She paused. I don't want to keep saying goodbye at the end of the night. I want to wake up with you. I want to have breakfast with Chloe. I want to build a life that's ours. Mason looked at his daughter, peacefully asleep, then at Vanessa, standing in the doorway of his cramped apartment with hope and fear written all over her face. And he realized something. For the first time since Emma died, the future didn't feel like something to survive. It felt like something to build. "Yeah," he said. "Let's do it." Vanessa's face broke into a smile. "Yeah? Yeah." She kissed him, soft and certain, and Mason felt the last piece of armor he'd been carrying fall away. They moved in together 2 months later. Vanessa's house was bigger than Mason's entire apartment building. 3 bedrooms, a backyard, a kitchen with an island Chloe immediately claimed as her art station. It took Chloe exactly 1 day to decide her new room was perfect, and approximately 3 hours to cover every surface with drawings and toys. Mason stood in the kitchen on their first morning there, watching Vanessa make pancakes while Chloe sat at the island coloring, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Home. Not a place. Not a building. But a feeling. A certainty that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Work continued to evolve. The expansion dealership thrived under Mason's leadership. He hired Greg away from the flagship location to be his lead technician, brought in young engineers who reminded him of himself at 25, and built a culture based on honesty and precision. Vanessa ran the main Silvercrest operation, but they consulted on everything. Decisions were made together. Problems were solved together. Success was shared. And slowly, the industry started to notice. Other dealerships reached out asking for advice. Manufacturers wanted to partner with them. Business schools asked Vanessa to speak about her leadership philosophy, but through it all, they kept their priorities straight. Mason still made it to Chloe's school events. Vanessa still had dinner with them every night she wasn't traveling. They protected their time together like it was sacred. Because it was. 1 year after Mason had first walked into Silvercrest wearing a fraying jacket and faded shoes, Vanessa threw him a surprise party. Not at the dealership, at home, with Chloe and Greg and Mrs. Kowalski and the small circle of people who'd become their family. Mason walked into the house after work to find streamers and a homemade cake, and Chloe bouncing with excitement. "Surprise, Daddy!" He looked at Vanessa, confused. "What's this for?" "Your 1 year anniversary, at Silvercrest." "You didn't have to." "I wanted to." She smiled. "You changed my life, Mason. I wanted to celebrate that." They ate cake and told stories and laughed until Mason's cheeks hurt. And later, after everyone had left and Chloe was asleep, Mason and Vanessa sat on the back porch under a sky full of stars. "You know what I realized today?" Mason said. "What?" "A year ago, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd lost everything that mattered and was just going through the motions until Chloe was old enough to not need me anymore." Vanessa took his hand. "And now? Now I realize I wasn't broken. I was just waiting for the right people to help me rebuild." Vanessa leaned her head on his shoulder. "You weren't the only one rebuilding." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars. Then Mason said, "Marry me." Vanessa's head snapped up. "What?" "Marry me," Mason repeated. "I don't have a ring. I didn't plan this. But I love you, and I love the life we're building. And I don't want to spend another day pretending this is temporary." Vanessa's eyes filled with tears. "Mason, you don't have to answer now. I just needed you to know." "Yes." Mason blinked. "Yes?" "Yes, I'll marry you." She laughed through her tears. "I've been waiting for you to ask for 3 months." Mason kissed her, and it felt like coming home all over again. They told Chloe the next morning. She was eating cereal at the kitchen island when Vanessa and Mason sat down across from her. "Chloe, we need to talk to you about something," Mason started. She looked up, suddenly serious. "Am I in trouble?" "No, sweetheart. Nothing like that." He paused. "How would you feel if Vanessa and I got married?" Chloe's eyes went wide. "Really?" "Really. So she'd be my stepmom? If you're okay with that." Chloe thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. Then she launched herself across the island and hugged them both so hard they almost fell off their chairs. "Can I be in the wedding?" Vanessa laughed. "You can be whatever you want to be." "Flower girl?" "Absolutely." Chloe pulled back, grinning so wide her whole face lit up. "This is the best day ever." And watching his daughter's joy, feeling Vanessa's hand in his, Mason realized something important. Happiness wasn't something you found. It wasn't something you earned or deserved or waited for. It was something you built, one choice at a time, one honest conversation, one moment of bravery when fear told you to run. Mason had spent 2 years believing he didn't deserve a second chance, that his shot at happiness had died with Emma, and the best he could hope for was to survive until Chloe was grown. But he'd been wrong, because life didn't stop giving you chances just because you'd failed before. It didn't punish you for being human, for making mistakes, for choosing the wrong thing sometimes. Life just kept offering you moments, small, quiet moments where you could choose to stay closed or choose to open yourself to the possibility of something more. And every time Mason had been tempted to choose safety over risk, something had pushed him forward. Chloe's questions, Vanessa's trust, his own stubborn refusal to let fear win. They got married 6 months later in a small ceremony in Vanessa's backyard. Chloe wore a white dress and carried flowers and cried happy tears when Mason and Vanessa exchanged vows. Mrs. Kowalski sat in the front row dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. Greg served as best man and made a speech about how Mason had gone from broke and desperate to running a dealership and marrying the boss, which got a huge laugh. But the moment Mason would remember forever came during the reception. He was dancing with Vanessa when Chloe ran up and tugged on his jacket. "Daddy, can I dance too?" Mason scooped her up, and Vanessa wrapped her arms around both of them, and they swayed together in the golden afternoon light. And as Mason held his daughter and his wife, surrounded by people who'd become family, he finally understood what Emma had been trying to tell him all those years ago when she got sick. She'd said, "Promise me you'll keep living. Promise me you won't let grief turn you into a ghost." At the time, Mason hadn't understood. He thought she meant he should just survive. Keep breathing. Keep going through the motions. But that wasn't what she'd meant at all. She'd meant live. Really live. Let yourself feel joy and fear and hope and love. Let yourself take risks and make mistakes and build something messy and imperfect and beautiful. Let yourself be human. Mason had kept his promise. It had just taken him a while to figure out how. As the sun set over the backyard and the music played and Chloe laughed in his arms, Mason looked at Vanessa and saw his entire future reflected in her eyes. Not perfect, not easy, but real and honest, and worth every moment of fear it had taken to get here. And that, Mason realized, was the only kind of happiness that mattered. The kind you built yourself. The kind you fought for. The kind that knew you were broken and loved you anyway. The kind that reminded you that second chances weren't just possible. They were everywhere, waiting for you to be brave enough to reach for them.